The hum of the aircraft blended with the quiet murmur of passengers settling into their seats, the clinking of glasses as flight attendants prepared for takeoff, the faint rustle of newspapers being unfolded. In the heart of the first-class cabin, where luxury and exclusivity were expected, an elderly black man adjusted himself in his seat, his movements slow but composed, his eyes scanning the cabin with quiet observance. Beside him, Karen Whitmore exhaled sharply, shifting in her seat as if his mere presence had disrupted her carefully curated experience. Dressed in designer travel wear, her manicured fingers tapped impatiently against the armrest, her expression one of growing irritation. To her, first class wasn't just a service, it was a privilege, a statement of status, an assurance that she would be surrounded by the right kind of people. And today, that expectation had been shattered. At first, she did what people like her always did, subtle but unmistakable gestures of disdain. A pointed glance, a deliberate sigh, the exaggerated way she shifted to create distance, as if proximity to him was somehow offensive. But when that wasn't enough, when he remained unmoved by her passive hostility, she escalated. Words sharpened, actions became bolder, and with every moment she chipped away at his dignity, confident that no one would stop her. She was right. No one did. The flight attendants hesitated, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. The other passengers glanced up, then quickly away, choosing silence over confrontation. He was alone, surrounded by people who had decided he was not their problem. What Karen failed to consider, what she never even imagined, was that she was digging her own grave with every insult, every condescending remark, every act of cruelty disguised as entitlement. She believed she was untouchable. She assumed he was powerless. She had no idea who he really was. And by the time she realized, it would be far too late. Would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed silent like the others? Where are you watching from? Comment below. Like, subscribe for more stories that remind us why the truth always prevails. Karen Whitmore strode into the first-class cabin like she owned the entire airline. Her designer heels clicked against the polished floor, her perfectly manicured fingers adjusting the expensive silk scarf draped over her shoulders. She exuded confidence, but not the kind that came from genuine self-assurance. Hers was an air of entitlement, a belief that the world revolved around her whims, and that anything less than absolute deference was an insult to her status. She paused at the entrance, scanning the cabin with a practiced sneer, evaluating who belonged and who, in her mind, clearly did not. As she pulled off her sunglasses, her gaze landed on an elderly black man seated near the window. Her lips curled in disdain. He was dressed neatly, his suit well-maintained but aged, the kind of attire that suggested he had once been important but was now past his prime. Karen scoffed. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for the nearest passengers to hear. "First class just isn't what it used to be." The flight attendant at the front of the cabin, a young woman named Lisa, noticed Karen's expression and instinctively braced herself. She had dealt with passengers like Karen before, entitled, demanding, and always looking for something to complain about. Lisa put on her best professional smile. "Good afternoon, Ms. Whitmore. Welcome aboard. May I help you find your seat?" Karen barely spared Lisa a glance. "I know where my seat is," she snapped, stepping forward with exaggerated grace. As she approached her assigned seat, her expression darkened when she realized who would be sitting beside her. The elderly man was calmly flipping through a newspaper, seemingly oblivious to Karen's growing annoyance. She turned to Lisa, her voice dripping with condescension. "Is this some kind of mistake?" Lisa frowned. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Karen gestured toward the elderly man without bothering to address him directly. "Him. Are you sure he's supposed to be here?" Lisa's stomach twisted. "Yes, ma'am. His ticket is confirmed for first class, just like yours." Karen huffed, crossing her arms. "I find that hard to believe." Her voice rose slightly, ensuring nearby passengers could hear. "First class used to be exclusive. Now it seems just anyone can get in." The elderly man turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting Karen's with quiet patience. He didn't react to her words, didn't flinch under her scrutiny. Instead, he simply folded his newspaper and offered a polite nod. "Good afternoon, ma'am." Karen ignored him completely, addressing Lisa instead. "I want a different seat." Lisa hesitated. "I'm sorry, Ms. Whitmore, but first class is full. There are no other available seats." Karen let out an exaggerated sigh. "You can't be serious. You expect me to sit next to?" She trailed off, shaking her head as if the mere thought was unbearable. "Fine, but if he causes any problems, I expect you to move him." Lisa bit her tongue and nodded. "Let me know if you need anything." She quickly turned away before Karen could press the issue further. She had no doubt that this would not be the last complaint from the woman before takeoff. Karen sat down with a dramatic exhale, as if enduring some great burden. She removed her handbag and carelessly tossed it onto the seat between them, partially overlapping the elderly man's armrest. If she expected him to move or complain, he didn't. Instead, he simply adjusted slightly and returned to his newspaper, his expression unbothered. This only irritated Karen more. As passengers continued to board, Karen took out her phone and began texting furiously. Her fingers flew over the screen as she sent a message to one of her equally entitled friends. "First class is going downhill. Sitting next to some old man who clearly doesn't belong. I swear, they'll let anyone in these days." Every so often, she cast glances at the elderly man, waiting for him to do something that would validate her belief that he was out of place. But he remained quiet, composed, and completely unfazed by her presence. That, perhaps, was the biggest insult of all. He wasn't intimidated by her, wasn't seeking her approval, wasn't reacting the way she expected. The engines hummed as the last passengers settled in, and the flight attendants made their final checks. Karen glanced one last time at the man beside her and rolled her eyes. "This is going to be a long flight." Karen let out an exaggerated sigh, shifting in her seat as if the very act of sitting beside this man was exhausting. She reached for her oversized designer handbag and, without a word, dropped it onto the elderly man's lap. The weight of it landed heavily against his stomach. He let out a slight, startled breath, his hands hesitating before he carefully lifted the bag and placed it back onto the seat between them. Karen's eyes snapped at him. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked sharply. The man's voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "I just thought," Karen scoffed. "That was your first mistake." She grabbed the bag and shoved it back onto his lap. "You hold it. I don't want it on the floor." His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the bag's position so it wouldn't press too hard against his ribs. He nodded once, avoiding her gaze. Karen smirked. No one interfered. The surrounding passengers either pretended not to hear or simply chose to do nothing. That silence, that lack of resistance, fueled her. She stretched out her legs and turned toward him. "So what's your deal? Retired? Let me guess, factory worker? Or were you one of those guys standing outside a Walmart with a sign that says need work?" His grip tightened around the handbag, but he didn't respond. His lips pressed into a thin line, his posture slightly stiffened. Karen grinned. "Oh, come on, don't get shy now. What did you used to do?" The old man swallowed hard. "I worked in," Karen cut him off. "Let me guess, bus driver?" She snickered. "Or were you one of those people who wiped down tables at a diner for tips?" Someone a few rows away coughed awkwardly, but no one intervened. The old man's face flushed slightly. His fingers curled around the strap of the handbag, his shoulders tense. He turned his head slightly, looking toward Lisa, the flight attendant. His expression wasn't defiant, it was pleading. "Help me." Lisa hesitated for half a second, then looked away. Karen's smirk widened. No one was going to stop her. She leaned in, lowering her voice just enough so only he could hear. "You don't belong here." The old man exhaled shakily. His breathing was uneven, and for a moment he looked as if he might say something, but instead he simply lowered his head. Karen sat back, savoring the moment. "Lisa," she called sweetly. Lisa stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, Ms. Whitmore." Karen gestured toward the old man. "Are you sure he's supposed to be here?" Lisa's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She forced a tight-lipped smile. Yes, ma'am. His ticket is valid. Karen scoffed. That's not what I meant. First class has standards, doesn't it? She raised an eyebrow, waiting. Lisa hesitated. Then, finally, she said nothing. Karen turned back to the old man, triumphant. See, she murmured. Even she knows you don't belong here. His fingers trembled as he gripped the armrest, his gaze fixed on the seat in front of him. His face, now drained of color, looked tired, defeated. Karen smiled in satisfaction. Lisa, I want another seat. Lisa's voice was tight. I'm sorry, Ms. Whitmore, but first class is full. Karen rolled her eyes. Fine. But if he so much as breathes too loudly, I expect you to move him. Lisa nodded stiffly and walked away. Karen tapped her fingers against the armrest, growing increasingly irritated by how pathetically silent the old man remained. He had barely spoken, barely defended himself, just sat there as if accepting his place beneath her. That should have satisfied her, but it didn't. It wasn't enough. She wanted more. She glanced at the neatly folded newspaper in his hands. Without warning, she snatched it away from him and tore it down the middle, the paper ripping with a sharp, unforgiving sound. The old man flinched, his frail hands freezing midair, as if unsure of what to do. His lips parted slightly, eyes darting between the shredded remains of his paper. Karen smirked. Oops. Clumsy me. She tossed the torn pages onto the floor as if they were trash, brushing off imaginary dust from her hands. You probably weren't reading anything important anyway. What was it? Coupons? Obituaries? She scoffed. Figures. The old man didn't move. His eyes, filled with something unreadable, flickered for a moment before dropping to his lap. His fingers twitched slightly, as if resisting the urge to pick up the scraps. Karen leaned back with exaggerated ease, adjusting herself in her seat. Then, suddenly, she shoved her seat backward with force. There was a sickening thud as the seat's impact slammed into the old man's knees. A sharp inhale escaped him. His hands gripped the armrest tightly, his knuckles turning white. He didn't cry out, didn't protest, but the pain was evident in the way his legs tensed, the slight trembling in his fingers. Karen turned her head slightly, her lips curling in mock surprise. Oh, sorry, she said, though she made no effort to adjust the seat. Did that hurt? You should really keep your legs out of the way. This is first class, not a public bus. The old man pressed his lips together, his breathing unsteady. Karen chuckled under her breath. She could see the discomfort, the humiliation, the growing exhaustion in the way he sat there, trying to remain composed while she slowly broke him down. A passenger across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but said nothing. A woman in the row ahead peeked over her shoulder, her gaze lingering for a second before turning back around. The silence was overwhelming. Lisa, the flight attendant, stood a few rows away. Her posture was stiff, her hands clasped tightly together. She saw everything, but she didn't move. Karen let out a soft, victorious sigh. This was control. She stretched out her arms, then kicked her foot forward, lightly nudging the old man's shoe. His reaction was immediate. His hands clenched into fists for a brief moment before relaxing again. Karen grinned. Relax, she said, her voice coated with fake amusement. It's just a little space issue. But you wouldn't know about that, would you? I bet you've never had this much legroom before. The old man remained silent, but his breathing had changed. It was uneven now. Karen tilted her head, studying him like a predator observing wounded prey. Lisa took a small step forward, as if debating whether to intervene. Karen caught the movement and immediately turned toward her. Lisa, she said sweetly, but there was a dangerous edge to her voice. Lisa hesitated. Yes, Ms. Whitmore. Karen placed a hand dramatically over her chest. I feel a little cramped. Is there another seat available? Somewhere more comfortable? Lisa hesitated, shifting awkwardly on her feet. I'm sorry, ma'am. First class is full. Karen clicked her tongue in feigned disappointment. That's unfortunate. Well, I hope he understands that I need my space. After all, I paid for it. The old man's shoulders sank slightly. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the seat. Karen smirked. She grabbed her phone and snapped a photo of him. "Just documenting my flight experience," she murmured. "I'm going to leave a review." The old man turned his face away, but it didn't matter. Karen had already taken a picture. She returned to texting her friends. Karen leaned back in her seat, casually scrolling through her phone as if nothing had happened. She had humiliated him, hurt him, and claimed her dominance. Yet the old man remained silent, his posture stiff, his hands clasped tightly together as if holding himself together. His breathing was shallow, and he looked like he wanted to sink into the chair and disappear. But that wasn't enough. Karen wanted to see him break. She took a sip from her glass of water, rolling the cool liquid in her mouth. Then, with a slight twitch of her wrist, she let the cup slip from her fingers. It tumbled downward, tipping at just the right angle for the water to splash across the floor. A few drops landed on the old man's shoe, soaking into the leather. The rest formed a small, clear puddle beside his feet. Karen gasped dramatically, pressing a hand against her chest. "Oh no, my water spilled." She turned her gaze toward Lisa, feigning distress. "This is unacceptable. Someone could slip." Lisa's lips parted slightly. "I can clean that up, ma'am." Karen shook her head. No, I think our friend here can handle it." She gestured toward the old man with a sickly sweet smile. "I mean, he's just sitting there. Might as well make himself useful." The old man froze. His fingers twitched slightly, his body rigid with humiliation. Lisa hesitated, her weight shifting as if she wanted to object. But then, she glanced at Karen's expectant expression and lowered her gaze. The silence that followed was suffocating. Karen tapped her nails against the armrest. "What's the problem? I thought older folks like keeping things neat and tidy." She gave him a pointed look. "Or do you expect first-class service to cater to you?" For a moment, the old man remained completely still. Then, slowly, his hands unclasped, his shoulders hunched slightly, and he leaned forward. He reached down, gripping a napkin with trembling fingers. His hands shook as he dabbed at the water on the floor. The motion was slow, deliberate, painful. Karen smirked. Finally, she nudged Lisa with her elbow. "See? Some people just need a little motivation." Lisa's expression was carefully blank, but she didn't move to help. No one did. The old man's knees strained as he wiped the puddle, his body folding inward, his head tilted downward in utter submission. Karen let out a quiet laugh. She reached for a small bag of pretzels from her tray, turning it over in her hand. Then, with a flick of her fingers, she let it slip. The bag hit the floor beside the old man's hand. He stilled. Karen gasped again. "Oh dear, another mess. Since you're already down there, why don't you take care of that too?" The old man's shoulders tensed. His fingers clenched around the napkin. His breathing was shaky, uneven. He didn't move. Karen clicked her tongue. "Come on. It's just a few crumbs. You wouldn't want to leave a mess behind, would you?" A choked silence filled the space between them. The old man lowered his head even further. And then, finally, he reached for the bag. Karen's grin stretched wider. Lisa turned her face away. The old man's humiliation was complete. But Karen wasn't done. She leaned in slightly, her voice a hushed whisper meant only for him. "See? This is where you belong." The old man gripped the armrest as he slowly sat back up, his shoulders shaking slightly. Karen sat back, fully satisfied. She lifted her phone again and took another picture. She had won, but just. As she was about to type another cruel message, she felt something shift. She glanced up, her gaze sweeping across the cabin. Passengers were still silent, still passive. But there was something different. There was tension now, something lingering in the air. Karen's gaze flickered toward the front of the plane. Lisa was speaking with another flight attendant, her expression unreadable. Karen leaned back, watching the old man with amusement. He had cleaned the mess she made, endured her insults, and accepted his humiliation. But it wasn't enough. She wanted to see real defeat. Her gaze flickered to his face, noting how he squinted slightly as he looked at the seat in front of him. Then she noticed his glasses, thin, old-fashioned frames perched delicately on his nose. A slow smirk curled her lips. Without hesitation, she snatched the glasses off his face. The old man flinched, his breath hitching. His hands instinctively reached for the empty space where his glasses had been. "Please," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need those." Karen twirled the glasses between her fingers, inspecting them as if they were a cheap toy. "Wow, these are ancient. Do they even make frames like this anymore?" She held them up, pretending to examine them under the cabin lights. The old man's eyes followed them desperately, but his vision was unfocused, lost in a blur. He reached forward cautiously, but Karen leaned away, keeping the glasses just out of reach. "Oh, you really do need them, huh?" she mused. "That's kinda sad." She tilted her head, feigning sympathy. "I don't know, though. These don't really fit the whole first-class aesthetic. They make you look poor." She smirked. "Let me help you out." Before he could say another word, she tossed the glasses into the aisle. They skidded across the floor, stopping just inches from where a flight attendant was stepping forward. There was a soft, sickening crunch as her heel came down directly on them. The sound was quiet but final. The old man froze. His hands hovered midair, his lips slightly parted. He blinked rapidly, trying to process what had just happened. His body tensed, his fingers curling into fists before slowly unclenching. His breathing became uneven, shaky. Karen let out a dramatic gasp, placing a hand over her mouth. "Oh no, that was an accident, I swear." She pressed her lips together, fighting back a laugh. "You probably weren't using them for anything important, right?" He didn't respond. His shoulders slumped, his head lowered slightly, as if he was trying to hold himself together. Lisa, the flight attendant, hesitated before stepping forward. She bent down, carefully picking up what remained of the glasses. The frames were bent, the lenses cracked beyond repair. She glanced at the old man, her lips parting slightly, as if she might say something. But then she looked at Karen. Karen raised an eyebrow expectantly. Lisa's shoulders stiffened. She exhaled slowly and turned away. Karen smirked. The old man was now completely vulnerable. He couldn't see properly, couldn't read, couldn't even look around, without everything blending into an indistinct haze. He just sat there, silent, staring down at his lap, his face pale. Karen grabbed her phone and snapped another photo. "That's a shame," she said, tucking her phone away. "You should be more careful with your things." The old man's fingers twitched slightly, but he still didn't speak. Karen sighed dramatically and leaned back. She had won, but something felt different. She could sense it in the air. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Something had changed. She glanced up, scanning the rows ahead. Passengers still sat quietly, still avoided eye contact. Yet there was something unnatural about the stillness now. Lisa whispered something to another flight attendant, her movement stiff. A businessman 2 rows ahead no longer pretended to read his tablet. His gaze lingered on Karen for just a second longer than before. Karen crossed her legs, letting out a dramatic sigh as she turned to Lisa. "All right, I've been more than patient, but this arrangement isn't working for me," she said, her voice laced with irritation. "I need my space, and frankly, I shouldn't have to sit next to someone who clearly doesn't belong here." Lisa's jaw tightened slightly. "Ms. Whitmore, I've already informed you that first class is full. There are no other seats available." Karen gave a condescending smile. "Oh, I know that, but I wasn't talking about me. I was talking about him." She gestured toward the elderly man beside her. "Move him to economy. It's more appropriate." The old man stirred slightly, his hands tightening around the edge of his seat. Without his glasses, his world was blurred, disorienting. Lisa hesitated, glancing toward the front of the cabin. "Ms. Whitmore, that's not how seating arrangements work. He has a first-class ticket." Karen leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "And I'm a valued first-class passenger who spends good money flying this airline. I don't think you want me lodging a complaint, do you?" Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned toward the elderly man, exhaling slowly. "Sir, would you be willing to move to another seat in economy?" The old man's body tensed. His fingers curled slightly, his breathing uneven. I have a ticket for this seat." Lisa shifted uncomfortably. "I understand, sir, but it might be more comfortable for everyone if—" Karen cut in. "Oh, stop acting like this is a debate. Just do it already." The old man turned slightly, though he couldn't see the faces around him clearly. He was looking for something, any sign of resistance, any hint of support. But there was nothing. No one moved. No one spoke up. Passengers averted their gazes. A businessman busied himself with his laptop. A woman in the row ahead adjusted her air vent. No one wanted to get involved. A deep breath rattled in the old man's chest. Slowly, his fingers released their grip on the armrest. Karen tapped her nails against the tray table impatiently. With great effort, the old man reached for his cane. His movement was slow, strained. His back hunched slightly as he pushed himself upright. Without his glasses, the world around him was unstable, an unfamiliar blur. He had to pause for a moment, steadying himself. Karen rolled her eyes. "You're taking too long." Lisa took a step forward. "Sir, let me assist." "No," the old man murmured, voice barely audible. "I can manage." He took a step forward. His foot wavered slightly, and for a brief moment it seemed as though his knees might buckle. His fingers trembled as they tightened around the cane. He moved carefully, too slowly, as if each step required every ounce of his strength. Karen let out a quiet laugh under her breath. As he stepped into the aisle, another flight attendant approached, ready to guide him toward economy. Karen stretched her arms, settling deeper into her seat. Honestly, this flight just got so much better. The old man took another unsteady step, but without his glasses, his depth perception failed him. His cane tapped too far ahead, his balance momentarily thrown off. His foot caught on the edge of a seat. His body lurched forward. A sharp gasp escaped his lips as his knee buckled completely. He collapsed. The cane clattered to the ground as his body hit the narrow aisle with a dull thud. The sound reverberated through the cabin. For a moment, there was only silence. The old man groaned softly, his body trembling as he struggled to lift himself. His hand groped blindly, trying to find something to hold onto, but his world was a smear of color, and his arms were too weak to support his weight. Slowly, the old man tried again, his fingers slipping against the cold floor. No one moved to help him. Karen tilted her head. "Maybe he should just stay there," she said casually. "Might be the safest place for him." A few muffled coughs echoed from the surrounding seats. A man cleared his throat, but still no one reached out. Lisa exhaled sharply and bent down to assist him. Karen's voice was sharp. "Is this really a good use of your time? I mean, I am still waiting for another drink." The old man's hand twitched. His breath came faster, shallower. Finally, he managed to press one palm against the floor, pushing himself up inch by inch. His body trembled from the effort, his back curling inward, his movements slow and painful. After what felt like an eternity, he was on his feet again. His hand shook violently as he reached for the cane a flight attendant had retrieved for him. He took it, nodding slightly. He didn't speak. His humiliation was complete. Karen let out a satisfied sigh and turned toward Lisa. "Now about that drink." Lisa opened her mouth, hesitated, then simply nodded and walked away. The old man was led toward economy. His steps were even slower now, his cane tapping rhythmically against the floor. He did not look back. Karen leaned back, stretching comfortably. Karen adjusted her seatbelt, crossing her legs as she glanced toward the back of the plane. The old man was now settled in one of the worst seats on the aircraft, a narrow, stiff back chair right next to the restroom. He looked smaller there, hunched slightly, hands resting on his lap as if he was afraid to touch anything around him. A smug grin spread across Karen's face. She lifted her hand and waved mockingly in his direction. "Hope you enjoy the view. And don't forget to say hello every time you shuffle back and forth to the bathroom." Her voice carried effortlessly through the cabin, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. The old man gave no indication that he had heard her. He didn't move, didn't react. Karen leaned toward the businessman seated across the aisle from her and spoke in a slightly hushed but deliberately audible voice. "Finally, things are back to normal. First class should be exclusive, not some free-for-all experiment. She let out a light chuckle, shaking her head. If they keep letting just anyone sit here, what's next? Free upgrades for people who look sad enough. No one responded. The businessman continued staring at his laptop, his fingers unmoving on the keyboard. A woman in the row ahead straightened her posture slightly, but didn't turn around. Lisa approached with a drink tray. Her movements were stiff as she placed a fresh glass of wine in front of Karen. Karen accepted it with a smirk. You know, Lisa, I think I just saved your airline from turning into a charity. If I hadn't spoken up, we'd all still be stuck sitting next to him. Lisa's expression didn't change. Is there anything else I can get for you, Ms. Whitmore? Karen tapped a manicured nail against the rim of her glass. No, I'm good. But you might want to keep an eye on him. Who knows? He might try sneaking back up here when no one's watching. Lisa exhaled slowly, gave a small nod, and walked away. Karen settled into her seat, sipping her wine. She opened her phone and typed into her group chat. Mission accomplished. Got rid of the old man. First class is first class again. She locked her screen and placed the phone on her lap. The satisfaction of winning was settling in now. A sharp jolt ran through the plane, causing the glass in Karen's hand to tremble slightly. She clicked her tongue in annoyance as a few drops of wine spilled onto her napkin. A second jolt followed, stronger than the first. Overhead, the seatbelt sign flickered on, accompanied by a soft chime. The captain's voice came through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, the seatbelt sign is now on. We are experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Karen adjusted her belt with an irritated sigh. Perfect. As if this flight wasn't annoying enough already. As the turbulence continued, a sound came from the back of the plane. A sharp cough. Karen barely registered it at first. It was distant, blending into the white noise of the cabin. Another cough followed, this time more strained, more deliberate. Karen turned her head slightly. The old man sat still, but his posture was different now. His shoulders were tense, his breathing uneven. His hand had moved from his lap to his chest, pressing lightly against the fabric of his shirt. Lisa, who had been securing a cart near the galley, paused. Her gaze shifted toward the back of the plane. Another cough. This one came with a wheezing sound. Passengers in economy were now looking toward the old man. A flight attendant stepped forward, speaking in a low, urgent voice. Karen tapped her fingers against the armrest, watching. Oh, what now? She muttered. The old man's breathing had become irregular. His shoulders rose and fell unevenly, and his grip on the armrest tightened. His fingers trembled slightly as he struggled to take in another breath. Lisa stepped forward quickly, her tone sharper now. Sir, are you all right? Karen frowned slightly. She wasn't concerned, but she could tell that something about the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The turbulence rattled the plane again, but this time, no one paid attention to it. All eyes were on the frail figure near the back of the plane, struggling to draw in air. A flight attendant spoke into her intercom. We need medical assistance in economy. Karen tilted her head, watching as the situation unfolded. The tension in the air was undeniable now. Passengers whispered to one another. Lisa moved with urgency. Karen took another sip of wine, unfazed. Let them deal with it. She had nothing to worry about. Karen took another slow sip of her wine, watching with mild amusement as the flight attendants moved frantically near the back of the plane. The old man was hunched forward, his hands gripping the armrests tightly, his breathing uneven. One of the crew members held an oxygen mask, speaking to him in hushed but urgent tones. Passengers in the economy section whispered among themselves, some glancing toward the scene with curiosity, others looking away as if pretending it wasn't happening. Karen smirked. Pathetic. If he couldn't handle air travel, he shouldn't have been on the plane in the first place. Lisa hurried down the aisle, stopping near the business class section to speak into her intercom. Her voice, though professional, carried a new level of urgency. We need immediate medical assistance for a passenger in distress. Karen rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath. Distress. Right. A soft chime rang through the cabin. The seatback screens flickered briefly before turning a solid shade of red. Karen's brow furrowed slightly. That was unusual. Passengers shifted in their seats, their quiet conversations dying down as a low crackle sounded from the speakers. A calm but firm voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your flight operations center. We have an important announcement." Karen straightened slightly, fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass. The voice continued, steady but commanding. "We kindly ask that all passengers remain seated and attentive." A murmur rippled through the cabin as the screens changed again, displaying a message in bold white letters against a red background. "The chairman of this airline is on board this flight." The entire cabin fell silent. Karen blinked, the smirk fading from her lips. Lisa, who had been kneeling next to the old man just moments ago, remained completely still. Several passengers exchanged stunned glances, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity to something far more serious. Karen let out a short, confused laugh. "Wait, what?" She looked around, expecting someone to explain, but no one spoke. The intercom crackled again. "For security reasons, we are unable to disclose further details at this moment. However, we ask all crew members and passengers to remain cooperative while we address this matter." The silence in the cabin felt different now. It was heavier, more suffocating. Karen's heartbeat quickened slightly. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the announcement. The chairman of the airline was on this plane? That seemed unlikely. Her eyes drifted toward the back of the plane. The old man sat slumped in his seat, surrounded by flight attendants, his breathing still labored. One of them knelt beside him, checking his pulse. Another pressed the oxygen mask gently against his face. Karen's fingers tightened slightly around her wine glass. The possibility formed in the back of her mind, creeping forward like an unwelcome shadow. She refused to believe it. The turbulence rocked the plane again, but no one seemed to notice. All attention remained focused on the frail figure near the rear of the cabin. Karen clenched her jaw, swallowing down a strange sense of unease. She wasn't ready to accept the truth. She still believed she was in control. Karen sat still, gripping the armrest as the announcement from the Flight Operations Center lingered in the air. The chairman of the airline was on this flight. The atmosphere had changed entirely. No one spoke. No one moved. Lisa, standing just a few feet away, had gone pale. Her hands trembled as she clutched her intercom, her breaths uneven. A soft murmur spread through the cabin, but it wasn't excitement. It was dread. Karen tried to swallow the tightness in her throat. "It doesn't mean anything," she told herself. "It's just a coincidence." Then a voice cut through the silence. "Wait a second." A man in business attire, seated near the aisle, was staring at his phone. His eyes darted between the screen and the old man in the back of the plane. His expression shifted from confusion to sheer disbelief. "Holy," he sucked in a sharp breath. "Oh my God, it's him." Karen stiffened. The businessman turned his phone outward, showing a photo of an older man in a tailored suit, shaking hands with world leaders, standing beside government officials, cutting the ribbon at an airport opening. The name beneath the images was unmistakable. Marcus Holloway, former FBI director, current chairman of Atlantic Airways. A sharp gasp rippled through the cabin. Lisa dropped her intercom. The small device hit the floor with a clatter, but no one reacted. Karen's blood turned cold. Passengers twisted in their seats, eyes flickering between the image on the screen and the frail old man struggling for breath near the restroom. Lisa took a slow step forward, her face frozen in horror. "No," she whispered, barely audible. Karen's chest tightened. "No, this can't be right." The businessman looked around, his voice rising. "That's him, the chairman of the airline. We just threw the chairman of the airline into the back row." Someone gasped audibly. A woman covered her mouth with both hands. Lisa whirled around. She rushed down the aisle, past frozen passengers, past stunned faces, and dropped to her knees in front of him. "Sir, Mr. Holloway." Her voice shook. We didn't know. We had no idea. Please forgive us." Karen couldn't breathe. Marcus Holloway exhaled slowly. The oxygen mask covered most of his face, but even in his weakened state, his presence dominated the room. He looked at Lisa, at her desperate, horrified expression, but he said nothing. Karen's hands trembled. "This isn't happening." The businessman near the aisle ran a hand through his hair, still staring at the phone. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "We let that woman treat him like dirt." Karen's stomach twisted violently. All around her, passengers were realizing. The ones who had watched silently, the ones who had turned their backs, the ones who had let it happen. They all knew now. Karen's breath came short and fast. Lisa was on her knees, begging for forgiveness. Passengers whispered. A man muttered something about legal repercussions. A woman near the window shook her head in disbelief. Karen felt their eyes turning toward her. Her hands clenched into fists. This wasn't how the flight was supposed to go. And worst of all, this wasn't over. Karen's chest tightened as she watched Lisa kneeling before Marcus Holloway, the once powerful flight attendant now reduced to pleading for forgiveness. Around the cabin, passengers whispered, some pulling out their phones to record, others staring at Karen with a mixture of disgust and contempt. Her mind raced, trying to grasp the full extent of what had just happened, but before she could even process it, a sudden chime echoed through the plane speakers. The captain's voice came through the intercom, steady yet laced with an undeniable sense of urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have received an executive order from Atlantic Airways headquarters regarding passenger Karen Whitmore. Effective immediately, Ms. Whitmore is permanently banned from all domestic and international flights operating within U.S. airspace. Upon landing, federal authorities will be waiting to escort her off the aircraft." Karen's heart stopped. A suffocating silence filled the cabin. Then, a man a few rows ahead laughed under his breath. A woman shook her head in disbelief, muttering, "She deserves it." Karen's fingers curled into the fabric of her seat. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." But it was far from over. Lisa, regaining her composure, straightened up and turned to Karen with a cold, professional demeanor. "Ms. Whitmore, as per company orders, you will be relocated for the remainder of this flight. Please gather your belongings." Her voice, once filled with forced patience, now carried nothing but authority. Karen's body refused to move. You can't do this," she stammered, looking around for support. But all she saw were blank stares and the glow of phone screens recording every second of her downfall. I have rights. I paid for this seat." Lisa didn't flinch. "And now you've lost it." Karen's breathing grew erratic, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone, but before she could even unlock the screen, a passenger seated across the aisle turned his device toward her. A breaking news alert flashed across the display. Karen's stomach dropped. A new headline, bold and damning, dominated the screen. Homeowner Association President Karen Whitmore exposed. History of racial discrimination uncovered. Her vision blurred as her name filled every notification, accompanied by images of past complaints, lawsuits, and dozens of testimonies from former neighbors, employees, and victims of her cruelty. More alerts popped up. Another scandal. A video resurfaced. Everything she had ever done was coming back to bury her. Someone read a tweet aloud. "Her entire history is out. They found everything." Lisa didn't wait for Karen to respond. She gestured toward the aisle. Now, Karen's legs felt weak as she stood, the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on her. Passengers shifted to let her through, though some didn't even bother hiding their smirks. As she took a step forward, another headline flashed across a nearby screen. Karen Whitmore's assets frozen amid investigation. Family severs ties. Her breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered. The passenger in front of her turned their screen slightly, revealing a formal statement issued by her own family. "We, the Whitmore family, do not condone the actions of Karen Whitmore. Effective immediately, we are cutting all financial and personal ties with her. We will not provide legal assistance." Karen's knees nearly buckled. Her family had abandoned her. A deep, suffocating panic rose in her chest as she stumbled toward the back of the plane, forced to take the very walk of shame she had once made Marcus Holloway endure. But unlike him, no one pitied her. She was shoved into the cramped, foul-smelling seat near the restroom. Her once pristine first-class ticket reduced to nothing but a worthless scrap of paper. She pressed a trembling hand to her forehead, trying to steady her breath, but the whispers wouldn't stop. The headlines wouldn't stop. The realization wouldn't stop. Everything she had built, her wealth, her status, her influence, was gone. And for the first time in her life, Karen Whitmore had absolutely nothing. Marcus Holloway, now seated comfortably, exhaled and closed his eyes, finally at peace. Justice had been served. The end. What do you think of Karen's punishment? Did she deserve worse? Where are you watching from? Comment below. Don't forget to share this story and subscribe for more powerful justice stories.